Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on citizen science and phosphorus monitoring in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. My name is Carla Zubricki, and I'm a project manager at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, headquartered in Winnipeg, and I work for IISD's water program. I'd like to welcome both our attendees and our guest presenter. We have teachers and students from various cities and towns in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and North Dakota on the line today, and some will also be joining the webinar recording afterwards. And in the room with me at IISD's office in Winnipeg is our guest presenter, whom I would also like to welcome. Kirsten Earl McCorrister is here from the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. Kirsten is a programs director at LWF and is working with other LWF staff and some enthusiastic scientists who sit on their board to develop a new citizen science friendly approach to monitor phosphorus in the watershed. A few months ago, I saw a demonstration of their new monitoring approach and I thought, wow, this is just the sort of thing I need to share with the teachers and students in our monitoring project. Just to clarify, you guys have done some monitoring for phosphates using those little tubes filled with powder that turns color. It was the closest thing I could find to nutrient monitoring when we started this project. And it's helpful for a general indication of nutrients in the water, but I'm really impressed by the Lake Winnipeg Foundation's approach, which gives a much more specific number for the phosphorus, as Kirsten will explain. Phosphate gives us some knowledge about nutrients in the water, but it's phosphorus that drives blue-green algal blooms and is the nutrient we really need to understand to help our waterways and Lake Winnipeg. So it's so great that the foundation has developed a monitoring approach specifically for this challenge. So I'll pass it over to Kirsten in just a second to tell you all about it. But first, I'd just like to give you a few ground rules for the webinar. If my slide will change. There we go. Oh yeah, sorry, I should have changed that. There's a photo of Kirsten. Webinar guidelines. I'd like to ask everyone to please keep their microphones on mute during the presentation, just so we can avoid background noise. Also, we will have a question and answer session after the presentation. When you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. You'll see it at probably at the bottom of the screen, or it might be a pop-up on your screen if you've maximized your screen. And then I'll read the questions out loud. We find that this is easier than having attendees unmute themselves, as sometimes the microphones on the computers don't work. If you run into any technical issues, I encourage you to contact my colleague from IISD, Jennifer Temmer, who is online today to help with troubleshooting. So her email address is on the screen, and you can also contact her through the chat system in the webinar. And she'll stay available throughout the webinar to try and solve any problems that arise. Without further ado, I'll bring up Kirsten's presentation and pass it over to her to tell you about their community-based monitoring.
Thanks so much, Carla. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and talk a little bit about community-based monitoring and some of the role that teachers and students might bring. We're still developing what that might look like. As Carla said, my name's Kirsten, and I'm the programs director at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. So today I'd like to talk to you about our citizen science program, about data deficits, and the role that schools and education organizations can play in helping to monitor the landscape in Manitoba. Over the past 2 decades, we've heard a lot of bad news coming from Lake Winnipeg. We see a lot of the algae washing up on the shore. Beaches aren't necessarily safe for our kids or our pets to swim in. And of course, we've seen the arrival of the new invasive species, well, new to us, zebra mussels. However, the biggest challenge is the phosphorus loading that's causing the algae blooms. The challenges that these face are complex, and they can be overwhelming, but they're not insurmountable. LWF, the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, has developed the Lake Winnipeg Health Plan to address the phosphorus loading, the root causes of harmful algae blooms in Manitoba's lakes. Under each of these 8 actions, we advance solutions by funding research and stewardship, by building innovative collaborations, and by working constructively with government to influence policy. We also run a comprehensive outreach and education program. So if you want us to come speak at your schools, let us know. Today, though, I'd really like to talk to you about Action 4, which is monitoring our waterways. At LWF, we talk a lot about making smart, evidence-based decisions. But in order to make those decisions, we need solid data from all areas of the watershed. But before I launch into what we know about our watershed, I'd like to share a story with you. This is my son, Ian, and he's a little bit older now. He's 11, but this picture was taken when he was 5 years old. It was the fall, and as they do each year, the geese were heading south for the winter. And Ian, little 5-year-old Ian, looked at me and he said, "Mom, I know why the geese fly in a V." And I was pretty keen to hear, why do they fly in a V? And he replied, "They fly in a V so that if a goose gets lost, he can look up and see the V and know that that stands for vacation migration." So, and I thought that that was just a funny little graphic that would go along with that. So, Ian, being 5 years old, was experiencing a data deficit. He didn't have all the data he needed. So he couldn't call up a scientist. He couldn't go to a library because he was only 5 years old. He didn't have the relationships needed to build a network of knowledge because most of his friends were also 5 years old. And he didn't understand the full story. And therefore his conclusion, though creative, was incorrect. So what he was really experiencing was a data deficit. We also have a similar situation in the Red River Basin. So the slide that you're looking at now is information taken from the State of the Lake report, which was published in 2007. And this is the most recent data that we have from the provincial government. What do we know? So the provincial government and Environment Canada have strong, solid monitoring programs for major points along the major tributaries. Through this data, we know that the Red River is the largest contributor to phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg. It contributes 68% of the total phosphorus load to the lake. But we also know that different reaches of the Red River contribute different phosphorus loads. This map shows the annual average phosphorus loads for 2 reaches of the Red River. Between Emerson and St. Norbert, it's a largely agricultural landscape, and from their best guess at calculations, every hectare of land exports on average 0.66 kilograms of phosphorus per year. And I want you to remember this number because this is a very important number. Between St. Norbert and Selkirk, which is a largely municipal landscape and includes the city of Winnipeg, every hectare of land exports 1.58 kilograms of phosphorus per year. So it's a much higher amount. That being said, it is a municipal landscape, and hopefully we can address that by looking at wastewater treatment in the city of Winnipeg and the city of Selkirk in these municipalities and address that phosphorus loading that way. However, in order to address the phosphorus loading coming from the Canadian side of the Red River, we need to really look at the agriculture land. That's 0.66. That 0.66 number. So this map, again, is from the 2007 State of the Lake report, and it shows the average export of phosphorus per hectare per year from the 5 major sub-watersheds in the Canadian side of the Red River Basin, according to current monitoring programs. And so what you see is that there's a 0.27, 0.33, 0.33, 0.24, 0.14. But if you remember the important number from the last slide, that number is much higher, 0.66. So if all of these sub-watersheds are exporting these smaller amounts, where is this coming from? There's a discrepancy in data. And there's no, and this missing phosphorus has been acknowledged, and no one really knows where it's coming from. So enter citizen science. So the LWF, sorry about that, the LWF Science Advisory Council, the group of scientists that we work with, tells us that this discrepancy comes from a data deficit in the Canadian side of the Red River Valley. So to begin to address this deficit, this spring, we launched a citizen science network with financial support from WWF Canada, the Manitoba Sustainable Development, and water stewardship partners from across Manitoba. Our goals were to increase public engagement and to provide data to support evidence-based decision-making for our water. So, spoiler alert, we've begun to find some of the answers to this data deficit. But before I share those, I want to explain why we made the decision to use a community-based monitoring approach and talk about some of the value add of this approach. At a national level, throughout 2015, LWF worked with water stewardship partners across Canada to explore the challenges facing CBM and identify some innovative solutions to address those challenges. 5 case studies were presented in a national paper. There's the cover page of the paper right there, earlier this year, and LWF's program was included as a model for developing credible protocols. So listed there are the 5 challenges that this paper identifies in terms of community-based monitoring. There's ensuring credible data, connecting Indigenous traditional knowledge and Western science, engaging and motivating citizens, informing decision makers, and data accessibility and translation. What this paper shows is that CBM is a legitimate and likely necessary component of innovative, adaptive, 21st century water monitoring programs. So what we're discovering is no one agency or organization has the capacity to do it all. But by coordinating efforts, we can build credible and useful data sets to better manage our water resources. This paper also raises questions, but with no answers, about the role of schools, the schools and education programs can have within citizen science. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later on. So, a bit of background. In October 2015, LWF convened Manitoba's community-based monitoring water groups for the first time. This gathering, so I'll just mention the groups that were included from the educational sector. It included representatives from Riverwatch, the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre, Fort White Alive, and Youth Encouraging Sustainability. There was a number of other organizations there that didn't represent educational programs, and in total there was about 33 people there. Together, these groups came together and committed to build a community-based monitoring network for Manitoba that would develop shared protocols, tools, and trainings for all partners, subsidize analysis costs, which are a major barrier for local groups, and would ensure that the data collected was interpreted and shared back to the community partners in a way that was useful and accessible. So, the pilot project, what did we do? We knew that we didn't want to go too big too quickly, so we kept it small, and we launched this pilot project this past spring. As phosphorus is our main concern, as we talked about earlier, that is the one parameter we are testing for at this time. It's relatively easy and relatively cheap to test for. So what we did is we partnered with 2 conservation districts, the Seine Rat River and the La Salle Red Boyne. We were also involved tangentially with the Riverwatch program. Over 8 months, our partners collected 200 samples at 9 sites that are part of the Water Survey of Canada hydrometric network. It's a mouthful. So I wanted to take a minute. If you remember when we were talking about that national paper, 2 of the really key points were data credibility and data utility. So I want to talk about those a little bit. Our science advisors have professional expertise in analytical water chemistry and nutrient dynamics, and they have decades of experience working at the experimental lakes areas, on Lake Winnipeg, and around many Great Lakes around the world. What they did was they developed shared sample collection and analysis protocols. So protocols for the sample collection, how it would be collected so that it would all be the same, and then also develop protocols for analyzing those water samples. They provided training to any community members or partners who participated in the network. Our protocols are focused on phosphorus, the driver of eutrophication, and so we're gathering that information. The samples were analyzed using federal protocols in a federal lab that meets international standards for phosphorus analysis in order to ensure compatibility with existing government and academic data sets. So we want to make sure that the citizen science that we collect, anything that we collect, can be compared to the existing data sets. So we're always comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. We also wanted to ensure that citizen-generated data was useful in answering management and policy questions. We partnered with the Manitoba Conservation Districts, who are effectively on the front lines of water stewardship. They helped us to refine the protocols and improve the communication to ensure that the data would be useful to the CD managers in their planning and program. And of course, data is only useful if it's easily understood. So all network partners agree this is crucial to our success. Our science advisors have again guided us through the analysis and interpretation of this data and are presenting it to community and government partners. We're also going to be sharing it online through the Lake Winnipeg Basin Information Network, so it will ultimately be available to everyone. So this is the exciting part. This is what we found. While our pilot project included 2 CDs and multiple sites, I'm going to focus today on data from 2 of our 2016 sites, and they are both in the Seine River watershed. The Manning Canal, which is represented by the gold star that you see, is a largely agricultural landscape and includes the city of Steinbach. The Upper Seine site, which is represented by the blue star there, drains a more forested area. So, and this is where we get into the science part, and I'm not a scientist, so bear with me. This graph shows the flow of water at these 2 sites, along with the flux of phosphorus. So the flux is the total calculated amount of phosphorus being carried by that water every day. So it's very important to note the flux. So the phosphorus loads are, the flux is in those dark lines, and the water is in the lighter lines. We understand from previous research that high water events tend to be high phosphorus events. So if you look, that first peak in the graph is during the spring melt, and we see a huge amount of water flow, but more importantly, we see a huge amount of phosphorus running off the fields through that dark line. If we don't sample our waterways during and after these high water events, we're likely to miss much of the phosphorus loading, and that's where we're seeing the data deficit. The province of Manitoba does currently test some of these sites, but they test it on a regular schedule. So they will test 4 times per year, and it may not actually coincide with these spring melts or these extreme weather events. I should point out the second large peak there was a significant rainfall that happened in early May. So what we're hoping is we hope to continue to work with the CDs, but we also know that there are schools around these stations, and we hope that they could help us capture some of this data because they're already out on the landscape when these events happen, and they could easily be mobilized by a network coordinator who is monitoring the Water Survey of Canada data online in real time. So, what did we find? Back to the important number. I hope you all remember the important number, 0.66. So that 0.66, in science terms, probably you all know this, but I did not know this because I am still on a learning curve. That's called the export coefficient. So that's what we're using our citizen science data to calculate, the phosphorus export coefficients, the number of kilograms of phosphorus exported per hectare of land. So comparing the two samples within the same watershed up in the first table that's listed, you can see there's considerable variation. In the upper Seine at St. Anne that flowed through a lot more forested area, you see an export coefficient of 0.48. But in the Manning Canal, which flows through both significant agricultural land and the city of Steinbach, you see an export coefficient of 1.1. So these numbers really highlight the importance of covering as much ground as we can to figure out where these nutrient hotspots are. Citizen science volunteers, including schools distributed across the landscape, can help us do that in a cost-effective way. So when we compare that upper table, which is the citizen science data that we collected, to what was previously reported in the State of the Lake report, we can see that the citizen-generated data is suggesting considerably higher phosphorus exports than previously reported. So the export coefficient that were previously reported at the same river at the perimeter, so where all of that watershed comes out, was 0.33. You can see that both of our numbers, 0.48 and 1.1, are considerably higher than that number. And it also shows that that 0.66, which is listed as the total amount of phosphorus coming between Emerson and St. Norbert, is 0.66, which is, again, at least that Manning Canal number it's lower than that Manning Canal number. So we're working towards a long-term data set because we know you can't just judge from 1 year. Maybe this year was an anomaly, although we don't actually believe that it is. But we are going to work towards a long-term data set. But this is what the first year of data is telling us. It's telling us that there's something very interesting going on and that there's potentially useful information to identify these data deficits and for better management of our water resources. So what does this mean? Not all land in the watershed is equal in terms of phosphorus, in terms of the phosphorus it's contributing. So you can see these are the other numbers that we found in some of the testing that we did, 0.51 and 0.61. But if we can identify these nutrient hotspots and we look at this one area that's 1.1, we can address it in a much more targeted way. So if we have a certain amount of money to apply to interventions on the landscape, we should actually be looking at applying them within that hotspot where the coefficient is 1.1. Because if we distribute that money all over the landscape, we're going to be wasting time, we're going to be wasting money. So without the right data, I just said this, we might be wasting time, money, and effort. But also a nimble and responsive network of trained volunteers can help us gather this information in a much more cost-effective and time-responsive way than some of the current monitoring programs are able to do because of their budget constraints. While agency programs can monitor major rivers, citizen scientists dispersed among the landscape can help us collect more data from smaller tributaries. So each of us can get involved in a hands-on way by sampling our own backyards. When we pool that data together, it will tell us the story of how to solve this challenge. It helps us break down this big, overwhelming, insurmountable problem down into manageable pieces. So what could be the role of teachers and students in this? As I said, this is still developing. This is going to be a focus for LWF and some of its partners in the coming year, trying to identify the best way to incorporate students and teachers and schools and education programs and all of those great things that are happening into this program. Oh no, there we go. I didn't get my animation correct. We know that many students and teachers are living in areas that LWF is working in to collect samples. So there's going to be obvious challenges. There's challenges of safety and permission forms, but we still think that schools and other youth organizations can contribute samples that will help us to fill in data gaps. So maybe the school might go out on a day when the scientists or the other citizen scientists weren't able to get out. It can help contribute to those data gaps and tell the story. I want to acknowledge that there's lots of current on-the-ground programs happening, and there's lots of enthusiasm to collaborate. And we don't want to build something new when there's already a great programs that exist. So we're trying to find ways that we can come into an existing program and maybe add one more component to that. Also, the data that we collect will come back to the teachers and groups, and it can be used as a teaching tool. So we can use this to show how their data, the actual samples that they collected, will fit into the big picture. It could also be used to inform other areas of the curriculum. So maybe the students might want to write letters to decision makers about the results and say, how can we incorporate this into our social studies program? Or maybe it might involve doing the math calculations themselves and seeing if they come up with the same calculations that our scientists came up with. So there's lots and lots of learning possibilities with this. So teachers would get this contextualized data back and they can use that. And LWF, the role that we can play is we can help provide training, we can provide our protocols, we can subsidize equipment and travel costs. So we're hoping that there's a role for us to play in supporting some of the great work that's already happening. So I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the next steps. While agency programs monitor major rivers, citizen scientists can, oh no, I'm repeating myself, sorry. LWF is committed to supporting and expanding Manitoba's citizen science network into 2017 and beyond. We're also exploring opportunities to bring the citizen science program into schools and universities, and that will provide the double win of hands-on environmental education and credible data generation. We're working to ensure we can support this stable network infrastructure over the long term. As I mentioned, we can provide things like subsidies for sampling equipment, lab analysis, training opportunities. We can support volunteer recruitment and coordinate some sampling activities. And we can fulfill our commitment to provide clear and accessible data interpretation so that all of our partners can use what they're learning. So you don't just get back one number, as I say, oh, look, there was this amount of phosphorus. You actually get back analyzed and contextualized data that can be that can actually be used in a collective effort to protect our lakes and rivers. I also wanted to say that in January, we are planning an event for a number of groups and educators to meet and discuss areas for collaboration and monitoring. That will be on January 24th and 25th at the International Peace Gardens. So please let me know, or you can contact Carla and she can contact me if you want more information about this event. So back to the geese. You didn't think I was going to abandon the geese altogether. So Ian, little 5-year-old Ian, was not totally wrong in his theory. He just got it a little bit backwards. So we know that geese fly in V's for lots of reasons, and the most particular is aerodynamics and efficiency. But one of the reasons that they do fly in formation is so that they can keep track of each other. So if one goose is missing or lost, as Ian suggested, the group can go looking for the missing goose, but the responsibility doesn't lie with the one lost goose. The responsibility lies with the whole flock. Collectively, we can address this data deficit to improve Lake Winnipeg and all of our shared waters. But the responsibility cannot lie with just one agency or group. The responsibility has to lie with all of us. And that is all I have, except I have a question slide. And don't ask me anything too sciencey, because I'm not a scientist.
Okay, we can email answers after.
We
if there is,
can.
We definitely can. Board members.
I have lots of science friends who will be able to help out with that.
Oh, thanks so much, Kirsten. That was absolutely fascinating. And can I extend your metaphor and say that each of our schools can almost be a one of the geese helping
they
to gather
absolutely
the data.
can. Every one of you is a goose and has an important role to play.
And I really, really like seeing everything broken down by sub-watersheds and areas, and to learn that each area can be contributing different amounts of phosphorus. So to have that distributed data collection is really important. And there are schools all over the watershed, and other agencies, conservation districts, watershed groups. So if we all pool our resources together and start, and more monitoring happens, we can start to have that data and then put it on the Lake Winnipeg Basin Information Network.
That's right.
Site. I think it's hosted by University of Manitoba, correct?
That's right.
And this data can be available to everyone to help make decisions. And so with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. And if you're having trouble finding it at all, you can message Jennifer, Temmer, or myself. But just to start off, while you're thinking of your questions, one question that came to me as you were presenting was, so we did precipitation monitoring as part of what the schools were doing for this project. And what we found was, and this was backed up by some Agriculture Canada data that I looked at, was that the watershed, or most of the watershed, received between 115% to 200% of normal rainfall precipitation in about the last 6 months. So we don't know if that trend will continue, right? We don't know if that'll happen in winter, but let's say it does, and we get a lot of snowfall, and then spring melt comes around, and you're particularly interested in spring melt, right?
That's right.
So I know you can't say for sure, but if that happens, if we have heavy snowfall and then spring melt, what might that mean for phosphorus loading in the watershed?
So what we have observed as an ongoing trend is we're going through a 2-decade-long wet period. This is related to climate change and the increased rain. So there's just more moisture in the air. And what we're finding is that in wetter years, so be that from snow and then you have the spring melt, or be that through extreme weather events, there is increased phosphorus coming off the landscape. It does depend on, and this again gets into pieces that I'm still learning about, but the amount of time it takes for it to melt. So if the water melts and sits on the field for a long time, it's almost like tea that is seeping. And so that water will absorb more and more phosphorus the longer it sits on the land. So if you have a lot of snow, it's going to melt. It's going to take a long time to drain out, and you're going to see those increased phosphorus numbers. And not only that, but it's going to become dissolved phosphorus, which is the really important phosphorus that we have to watch for, because that's just readily available phosphorus to be made into algae once it hits the lake.
Okay, and so we have this phosphorus loading issue in the watershed. We're monitoring, but I also like to extend solutions. How do you address these issues? I know LWF does some work in this area, so I'm just wondering if you can comment at all on what are some of the mitigation options, the solutions to help slow down and reverse this phosphorus loading trend.
I am definitely not an expert on this. I've had been involved in lots of conversations, but I know that scientists, producers, those are the people who are going to have the best answers. But we do know that looking at things like natural wetlands, so both retaining them, so not draining any more wetlands for agriculture use, will have a positive impact. Wetlands are really natural filters on the landscape, and if water can drain into those and sit, the vegetation within those pools will actually pull out the phosphorus before it reaches our waterways. We can also look at recycling water that comes off the landscape. So that really involves building retention ponds on farms. That's a big cost. But we are also trying to tell farmers that losing all of your phosphorus in the spring runoff, having all of that wash off your field, is in the tens of thousands of dollars as well. So if farmers are able to build retention ponds, and some of that water goes into that pond and then gets recycled throughout the summer season, there's advantages to that. And the other advantage is that we don't know when this wet cycle is going to flip and become a dry season. Scientists believe that's going to happen because has traditionally what has happened. We go through wet periods, we go through dry periods. And if we've just been through a 2-decade-long extreme wet period, the possibility exists to go through a 2-decade-long drought period. Mm-hmm. And if farmers have been proactive and built retention ponds, that means that they can really recycle that water, and that water will be desperately needed in those times. I'm sure that there's lots of others. There's lots of things around how you manage your livestock and how you manage manure. I am definitely not an expert on those, but there are definitely solutions that are being enacted, and we can continue to look at them, particularly if we can look at those hotspots and target the interventions there.
Yeah, you made some really good points there. I know in the 1930s drought, this is an aside, but farmers were actually making dugouts to store water so that they could provide water to their livestock. Because I'm sure, as many of the students and teachers know, the 1930s was called dirty 30s. There was a major drought then. It's actually that drought that caused Ducks Unlimited to form in the United States, because they realized we're losing our wetland habitat. And they're interested in ducks and waterfowl, but I mean, it was affecting all of society, all sectors, urban, rural. One other solution I wanted to mention is things like wastewater treatment. Kristen and I were very focused on wetlands and the whole landscape, but all of you are, I think, in cities, so it's also important. Everybody's responsible for helping to address nutrient loading concerns in the watershed, whether you're a farmer or you live in the city, and you want to make sure you have good wastewater treatment. You want to look at, what you're applying to your garden in terms of the fertilizers you use. So yeah, it's something to be aware of, and I think some good things are happening in the watershed to help address it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also say that it has come up at some of the gatherings. People have asked, well, could we start testing the water, doing citizen science to test the water that's coming out of lagoons in municipalities? And that might be an additional way to hold some of the municipalities accountable for some of the phosphorus that they are producing, and help them to understand exactly what they're contributing. So certainly this project does not necessarily have to continue to be limited to agriculture. We want to find solutions with everyone who's willing to work with us. And we know that sometimes these solutions are expensive, but they're necessary in order to really ensure for long-term sustainability and long-term health of all of our waters.
Hey, Kirsten, thanks. Are there any other questions? I don't see any that's come in. I have a lot more, actually. I'll probably keep talking with Kirsten after this. If you have any questions occur to you after the webinar, you can email me. I'll actually, well, you all have my email address, and I can pass it along to Kirsten if you're interested in getting engaged with this. You can email me, and we can tell you a little bit more about how to get engaged. But I'd like to now switch gears just a little bit, since I think we have time. I think you guys probably each get about a 1-hour lunch. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but you all went out and collected some data this summer and fall, and I just wanted to go over some of that on this webinar, since we have a little bit of time. So let me get my notes here. So you were collecting precipitation measurements, species observations, and then using the Freshwater Watch website, phosphates, nitrates, turbidity, temperature, and pH. And I just wanted to go over a few highlights. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail because I sent you the summary report just the other day. and go into more detail there, analyzing the data, commenting on it. Also giving some caution about interpreting data that, especially for the water quality stuff, that we only have a few data points. We're using pretty simple technology. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm absolutely delighted at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation's approach, which gives us a more specific number on phosphorus than our phosphate monitoring does. But I'll just go over a few key points. For precipitation, as I mentioned, we had between 115 and 200% of rainfall in some areas in the watershed compared to what we normally have. So this is a graph from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada showing percent of normal rainfall over Canada, and you can see the green and the blue, the dark green, and the blue are areas that have had significantly more than average, and you can see the key on the right there. And this is goes along with that wet trend that Kirsten mentioned that we're having, and all of that water is going to Lake Winnipeg eventually. And this was more during the summer, because I think that this data that they're reporting on here started in May. So it wasn't during that sort of phosphorus flush that happens during spring melt. But certainly some of this water will also have carried phosphorus and nutrients and sediments into the waterways. So it can contribute as well later in the season too to nutrient loading. And I just wanted to emphasize that link between the precipitation that you're measuring and then the nutrients that end up in our waterways, because there is a direct link that can be made. And now you guys can also do snow monitoring using your rain gauges. I don't think we trained you on using the snow gauges or the rain, or on measuring snow in the webinar we did in June, because winter was quite far away. But now it's here. So I'm gonna be sending out some resources for monitoring snow, how you can use your rain gauge to figure out how much snow has fallen. And I'll be emailing that out in the next few days. And I can also arrange for a webinar by Tiffany, the Cocoa Rock coordinator in Manitoba, if you want a bit more in-person live learning. This is just shows some of the data points for the heavy snowfall we had last week. It was over 3 days, and we got, so when you took the snow and melted it down, it was more than an inch total of precipitation in many areas. And so this is the total, this is the map for December 6th. It's just a screenshot I took. And the red, orange, and yellow are, well, there is no red there, but are where the heavier precipitation happened. So you can see how it was dispersed over the watershed. And you can see that in the more northwestern parts of Saskatchewan, they didn't get that much. And I was on the phone with someone from there last week, and we were talking about how Winnipeg had more than a foot of snow, and they barely had anything. So again, that highlights the big differences that can happen throughout the watershed. For species, so we're using iNaturalist to document the species we're seeing in the watershed. Canadian Geographic and their counterparts in the US started a page in March 2015 to track species in the watershed. It now has 114 members, so some of you included in that. Almost 2,000 observations on 668 different species in the watershed. So, and I have put a little screenshot map on the right there. You can see where we have some density of observations, and then also where maybe we need to recruit a few more participants to let us know what kind of species are living there. And these are plants, animals, all sorts of things. Along the bottom there, those insects that you see, those were all pictures taken and data reported by Neelan High School in Brandon. They were really active in collecting data, and they were so into it that they actually picked up the insects and took pictures. So good for them, and thanks for helping us to get an idea of what's living in our watershed. And next screen. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about our water monitoring as well. But before I talk about this data, I did want to note a few limitations, which I also detail in the report I sent. First of all, we only have 2 data points for most of the sites. For some of them, we only have 1. So we really shouldn't be making any firm conclusions about this. There can be natural fluctuations in some of these things. You really want to have long-term monitoring before you can make robust conclusions. And then one teacher in Brandon also found that the phosphate levels were not registering in his tubes in the fall, whereas he had some of the highest phosphate and nitrate levels in the spring in our study. And he was using tubes from a new batch of kits that were sent to me by Freshwater Watch. And he contacted me afterwards and asked, well, why were my readings so low? And I mean, I wasn't sure. You'd want to probably go out, take some more samples, get some field duplicates to know for sure. You want to investigate it more. And he raised the possibility of, well, could there be something wrong with the equipment? And I thought, yeah, that could be possible. And that is something that happens in science, even for the most seasoned scientists, is remember that, something can go wrong. And if the findings aren't what you expected, maybe that's something you should investigate more. So we're gonna take a look, try and test the new batches of equipment that we have before we send it out to see, okay, is the phosphate monitoring, does it seem to be reliable based on water that we know is high in phosphate? But so keeping that in mind, please, I've just put up one image from some data collected by the Louis Riel School Division in Winnipeg. They went out and did a monitoring blitz in one day along the Red and Assiniboine rivers. And this map summarizes just some of their findings. And it's also in the report I sent. So we can see that nitrates are low on the Assiniboine River. So the nitrates are in blue. And they showed up as 0.1 milligrams per liter. Elsewhere in the watershed, it even went up to close to 1. So basically that just means your tube turned a darker pink. So they were low on the Assiniboine River, variable along the Red River. And then you have the low, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on here, probably not, but I am pointing to where I'm talking to. There's a low reading on the low reading on the Red River shortly after it joins the Assiniboine. And one thought we had here was this could be due to the influence of the Assiniboine River. The measurements taken on the side of the river close to the Assiniboine inflow into the Red. So it might not have mixed enough yet for the nitrates from the Red River to mix with the lower levels in the Assiniboine. The phosphate levels, as we noted, there were some questions about our phosphate kits that we have. And I think this might have been one of the newer kits too, but this one shows a steady increase along the length of the Red River with little apparent impact from the inflow of the Assiniboine River when it flows into the Red River in Winnipeg. So we'll just, we'd want to collect more data points before we made any really conclusive, statements about what we're seeing here. And then one other thing I wanted to highlight was yellow water. I think this is the third case of this is the second and third cases of yellow water we've had in this study. Last time, I think there was Kildonan Duck Pond in Winnipeg reported yellow water, and we saw it again here. And why might this be? So on the left, we have a drainage ditch next to a wetland in Lake Francis, which is just like not far at all. It's connected to Lake Manitoba. And then we have Brookwood Pond in Brandon, and you can see it's got some urban areas nearby. So for when you see that, you might wonder, well, why is the water yellow? Normally this is due to a high amount of dissolved organic matter, so basically plant matter. Can be from leaves, grasses, other plants that are decomposing in the pond. And if you look at these pictures, it's pretty evident what plant matter that might be. There's a lot of the wetland plant cattail in both of these. So we would guess that these were contributing to the high organic matter in the water and turning it yellow. And this is sort of like steep tea, and this is something you mentioned earlier too, Kirsten. So the water can change color when something just sits there. In this case, it's the organic matter decomposing and releasing into the water. So you can get more detail in the report I sent you, but I just wanted to highlight a few interesting findings we had there. And with that, I'd also like to, again, open the floor to any questions about this data. We have 10 minutes left in the scheduled time, but I'm sure some of you have to run off to classes and such too. But if you have any questions, please post them right now in Q&A. Or you can also send questions to me afterwards via email, give me a call, anything like that. And I also have my email address up on the screen there if you have any questions for me or for Kirsten. Here's one question that came up from Doug Braden. A seminar was mentioned occurring in January. Will more information be emailed and or provided on the LWF website? I believe the dates mentioned were January 24th and 25th. These dates may conflict with high school exams.
So yes, we had a very hard time trying to find a date that would work for as many people as possible, and I apologize if your school's high school exams conflict. I have an invitation. I think I sent it to Carla. Yeah. So maybe Carla can distribute that invitation to this group, and you can receive the information. And then if you have additional questions after that, please contact me.
Yeah, and I'll CC you on that too, Kirsten, so we can get everyone talking back and forth. Thanks, good question. It would be great if some of you guys got involved and put our heads together with everyone who's interested in monitoring in the watershed. Looking to see if there's any more questions. It doesn't look like there is, so with that, I think we'll end the webinar, let you go prep for whatever you have happening this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll be following up afterwards by sending the webinar recording to everyone, and also the information we just discussed. Thanks so much, everyone, for collecting all the data and for joining us today. And thanks, Kirsten.
You're very welcome.
For the wonderful presentation, and to Jennifer for the technical assistance she provided. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.